Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. It's really easy historically to kind of point at and pick on Hitler because of how big of a dick he was. There are a lot of other historical characters that get a lot better press as time goes along than Hitler does, being so recent. However, with that being said, biggest asshole ever, part 2. Let's go.
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war, but he kept working for the army as an informant. After the war, communists in Germany had attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about communism in general. So Hitler was tasked with infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat. A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole bunch of red flags, so Hitler went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs, so he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking abilities impressed the party's leadership and supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top. He decided the party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme. The Nazis weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics, but what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right. Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive Whole Protection Detachment, later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment, or SA for short. Their job was to defend Nazi party meetings and intimidate political opponents, and they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which grew larger and larger over time.
So think about this in modern context. Think about if the parties that represented a political country just went out and essentially started fighting each other all over the place at any type of talks, any type of voting, any type of anything political or even apolitical. It really didn't matter. If they came across each other, they were going to smash each other. But imagine what that would look like in the modern day if every time that one party or another did anything at all, there was a huge group of people from both sides basically just beating the hell out of each other outside. That would be a wild situation and scenario, and both political parties would basically be giving their blessing to it and hoping that their side would come out on top in beating the other side up. It's really wild.
The new democratic government that formed after World War I was pretty weak and ineffective. In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919, one US dollar was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, one US dollar was equal to 4.2 trillion marks. The price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany struggled to pay the Allies. The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treated the German civilians badly, and in total, approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation.
So this is one of those situations that isn't really talked about a whole lot historically. Obviously, the treaty and the reparations are, but the Allies from the First World War, the British and the French specifically, were pretty harsh as far as the reparation policy went. Now, the U.S. had a far different view of how this should have worked out. Woodrow Wilson was on the record at the very end of World War I essentially saying, if you make a treaty that goes this way, it's going to cause all of these problems long term. But you have Germany, who is really struggling to regain its footing and its GDP after World War I because the entire country had essentially collapsed. So you have new governments, you have new businesses, you have new everything for the most part. And in order for them to pay reparations and still maintain somewhat of a functioning economy, the only thing that they could think of, or the guy that was handling their money, the only thing that he could think of was to print more money. This is historically one of the dumbest dummy ideas that has ever come about. But that was the move that they tried to make. And so exactly that happens. You have hyperinflation. The money is almost worthless. Now the British and the French, they have no use for the money that you're giving them for reparations. What are they going to do with these, trillion and trillion and trillions of dollars that you have that actually are almost worthless? And so it starts to kind of build into just this really big issue.
Germans were furious, and Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November 1923, inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters, he marched on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not. Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. And when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book. The whole affair was covered by the media nationwide, and it made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany, but the everyday German still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence and the shouting and how unpolitician-like he was, but a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic
Okay, so again, this is the U.S. trying to step in and help Germany in order to keep them on their feet, to pay back reparations, to have a stable economy. However, the U.S. is over-leveraging its economy at this point. And so all of these loans that it's giving out off of this kind of false hope or false idea of the U.S. economy back at home, it's going to completely destroy the U.S. economy, both all of the loans and money that it's giving out and the false idea of what the U.S. economy is actually like. And so nobody's viewing it kind of through this realism lens. Everybody has this idea very similar to the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis, where stocks only ever go up, housing prices only ever go up. And you have all of these things in place that work really well as long as the prices of everything continue to rise. But the second that that stagnates, it doesn't even have to drop. As soon as it stagnates a little bit, the whole system gets put into chaos. And actually, there's something very, very similar to this happening in China right now with Evergrande and their entire real estate industry and economic sector. It's very similar to this. It is kind of an entire economic system that is based on debt and loans and essentially over leveraging. And yeah, eventually, whenever prices stop going up or whenever interest in the product stagnates, you have a major issue that can totally collapse the economy.
The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype. Election after election, the Nazis became more and more popular, until in 1932, they became the biggest party in the German parliament. Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the leader of the biggest party though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism, and leader of the Center Party von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power, we'll get to keep our power and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet."
Okay, so this is exactly what von Papen tries to do. He tries to basically maneuver his way through the political situation to where he can corner Hitler. And essentially what he ends up doing is he ends up putting Hitler in a position where, with all of the support for the Nazi movement behind him and the seats in parliament by the Nazi party and the other political parties' kind of hatred of the way that the current political system was working, that power gave Hitler a position where he really could not be boxed in. And so von Papen totally overplays his hand here, thinking that he has power that he actually does not have. And so Hitler's going to end up turning this whole thing around. The support for the communists and for the Nazis in Parliament is going to make it to where von Papen basically has to give his power up, and he totally gets outplayed at every turn here.
What could